Picture this moment that exists in countless variations across the globe. A classroom where one desk remains perpetually empty during lunch, not because its owner is absent, but because they eat alone. A birthday party where the invitations seem to mysteriously skip one house on the street. A recess playground where certain children become invisible, watching as games form around them like water flowing around a stone. This is the landscape of exclusion, and it's far more common than we dare acknowledge. Recent studies suggest that up to 70% of children experience significant social exclusion at some point during their school years. That statistic represents millions of small hearts learning, in the cruelest way possible, that belonging is conditional. But what makes this phenomenon so psychologically devastating goes beyond mere statistics. The excluded child experiences something that neuroscience now confirms as genuine trauma. When researchers placed children in brain scanners while simulating social rejection, they discovered something startling. The neural pathways that light up during exclusion are identical to those activated by physical injury. The old saying, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me," is not just wrong. It's neurologically backwards. Physical wounds heal and fade from memory. Social wounds carve themselves into the architecture of the developing brain. To understand why exclusion cuts so deeply, we must journey back through evolutionary time. For our ancestors, being cast out from the tribe wasn't just socially uncomfortable, it was a death sentence. The human who couldn't secure their place within the group faced predators alone, hunted without backup, and weathered storms without shelter. Our survival as a species depended entirely on our ability to maintain social bonds. This evolutionary heritage means that when a child faces exclusion today, their nervous system doesn't distinguish between being left out of a game and being abandoned in the wilderness. The same stress hormones flood their system. The same hypervigilance kicks in. The same desperate scrambling for acceptance begins. What we're witnessing in that excluded child isn't oversensitivity or weakness. It's an ancient survival mechanism firing at full capacity in a modern context. Dr. Naomi Eisenberger, a leading researcher in social neuroscience, explains it this way. The brain treats social pain like physical pain, because from an evolutionary standpoint, they pose similar threats to survival. A broken bone could kill you, but so could being rejected by your group. This means that the child standing alone at recess isn't just missing out on fun. They're experiencing a biological alarm system that tells them their very existence is threatened. Their body prepares for danger that isn't coming, leaving them flooded with stress chemicals that have nowhere to go but inward, where they begin the slow work of reshaping identity. What happens next is perhaps the most tragic part of the exclusion story. The child's mind, desperate to make sense of their rejection, begins searching for explanations. But children, with their developing cognitive abilities, rarely blame the complexity of social dynamics or the cruelty of group behavior. Instead, they turn the microscope inward. "I must be weird," becomes the first whisper of self-doubt. "There must be something wrong with me," follows close behind. "I'm the kind of person who doesn't fit in," solidifies into belief. These aren't conscious thoughts, but felt truths that settle into the child's understanding of who they are in the world. Psychologists call this process internalization, and it's devastatingly efficient. Within weeks, the excluded child begins to carry their rejection like a secret they keep even from themselves. They start anticipating exclusion before it happens, reading rejection into neutral interactions, and most heartbreakingly, beginning to exclude themselves. Watch an excluded child in a classroom, and you'll see this internalization in action. They'll choose the desk at the back. They'll hesitate before raising their hand, even when they know the answer. They'll pack their lunch quickly and eat it somewhere quiet, telling themselves they prefer solitude. They're not antisocial by nature. They're protecting themselves from a pain they've learned to expect. The tragedy of childhood exclusion lies not just in the immediate pain it causes, but in how it shapes the trajectory of development. The excluded child learns lessons that extend far beyond social interaction. They learn about their worth, their capabilities, their right to take up space in the world. Consider how exclusion affects academic performance. When a child believes they don't belong, they're less likely to participate in class discussions, ask questions when confused, or seek help when struggling. Their silence, born from social wounds, begins to impact their learning. Teachers, unaware of the underlying dynamics, may interpret this withdrawal as lack of interest or ability, creating a secondary cycle of exclusion within the academic realm. The effects ripple into creativity as well. Children who feel excluded often stop sharing their ideas, their art, their unique perspectives. They learn that being different, the very thing that might make their contributions valuable, is also what makes them vulnerable to rejection. So they begin the long process of editing themselves, smoothing away the edges that might catch attention, dimming the light that might draw unwanted scrutiny. Dr. Brené Brown's research on vulnerability reveals how this self-editing becomes a lifelong pattern. The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. But most of us learn early that caves are dangerous places. We spend our lives walking around them instead of discovering what treasures we might find inside. Yet here lies one of psychology's most fascinating paradoxes. Many of the world's most empathetic, creative, and insightful individuals were once excluded children. The very experience that wounds them also grants them a unique perspective on human nature. When you're on the outside looking in, you notice things that insiders miss. You see the subtle power dynamics, the unspoken rules, the way groups form and reform. You develop what psychologists call social radar, an heightened ability to read emotions, detect discomfort, and recognize when others feel left out. This enhanced empathy often translates into extraordinary contributions to society. Consider the number of beloved children's authors who were themselves lonely children. Think of the musicians whose songs capture the universal experience of feeling different. Reflect on the therapists, teachers, and social workers who dedicate their lives to helping others feel seen and valued. The excluded child, when they find healing, often becomes the adult who creates the very spaces of belonging they once desperately needed. Their wound, transformed through understanding and compassion, becomes their gift to the world. But transformation requires intention, and not every excluded child finds their way to healing. Many carry their playground wounds into adulthood, where they manifest in subtle but significant ways. The adult who was once excluded might find themselves hesitating to speak up in meetings, even when they have valuable insights to share. Their inner child whispers, "What if they think I'm stupid? What if I say the wrong thing, and they realize I don't belong here?" Struggling with imposter syndrome, feeling like they've somehow fooled everyone into thinking they're competent or worthy. No matter how much external success they achieve, the excluded child within keeps waiting for someone to discover the truth about their inadequacy. Having difficulty forming close relationships, either by keeping people at arm's length to avoid potential rejection, or by clinging too tightly out of fear of abandonment. The excluded child learned that love is conditional and fragile, lessons that can poison adult relationships decades later. Perfectionism becomes another common legacy. If the excluded child concluded that they were rejected because they weren't good enough, the adult may spend their life trying to be flawless, believing that perfection is the only path to acceptance. But perfection is exhausting and impossible, leading to cycles of achievement and disappointment that never quite fill the hole left by childhood rejection. What makes childhood exclusion particularly insidious is how often it happens without malicious intent. Children learn to exclude others, not out of inherent cruelty, but as a way of defining their own belonging. Psychologists call this in-group/out-group behavior, and it serves an evolutionary purpose. It helps individuals identify their tribe and strengthen group cohesion. But understanding the function doesn't minimize the impact. A child doesn't feel less rejected because the exclusion wasn't personal. In fact, impersonal exclusion can sometimes feel worse, because it suggests something fundamentally wrong with who they are, rather than something they did. Consider the subtle ways exclusion happens. The birthday party where everyone finds out they weren't invited through social media posts. The group project where teams form naturally, leaving certain children without partners. The lunch table where conversations stop when particular children approach. The playground game where the rules mysteriously change when certain children want to join. These moments often pass unnoticed by adults, but they're seared into the memory of the excluded child. Years later, that child, now an adult, might still remember the exact feeling of standing at the edge of the cafeteria, tray in hand, scanning for a place to sit, and finding only closed circles and averted eyes. While children exclude each other, adults often inadvertently participate in the process. Teachers who consistently call on the same eager students, while overlooking quieter ones, send a message about whose voices matter. Parents who compare their children to more socially successful siblings communicate that acceptance is conditional on performance. Coaches who favor naturally athletic children, while ignoring those who struggle, reinforce hierarchies of worth. These adults aren't usually acting from malice, but from unconscious bias and limited awareness. The extroverted teacher may genuinely not notice the introverted student who has something to contribute, but won't fight for attention. The busy parent may not realize their distracted responses to their child's stories communicate disinterest. The overwhelmed coach may focus on winning rather than inclusion, without considering the long-term impact on developing psyches. But adults also hold the power to interrupt exclusion patterns. The teacher who notices the quiet student and creates opportunities for them to shine. The parent who validates their child's feelings about social struggles instead of dismissing them with "just ignore it." Advice: the coach who emphasizes effort and improvement over natural talent. These adults become lifelines for excluded children, offering alternative narratives about worth and belonging. The hopeful news emerging from neuroscience research is that the brain remains plastic throughout life. The neural pathways carved by exclusion aren't permanent highways. They're more like trails through a forest that can be overgrown with disuse, while new paths are beaten through repeated positive experiences. Daniel Siegel's work on neuroplasticity shows that new relationships, new experiences of acceptance, and new understandings of self can literally rewire the brain. The excluded child within us can learn new lessons, but it requires intention and often support from others. Healing typically involves several components. Recognition that the exclusion was about the limitations of others, not personal inadequacy. Development of self-compassion to counter the harsh inner critic formed during childhood. Creation of new experiences of belonging that challenge old assumptions about worthiness. Integration of the excluded child's perspective as a source of empathy and insight rather than shame. This process isn't quick or linear. The excluded child within might still flinch when entering new social situations or whisper doubts during moments of vulnerability. But with awareness and practice, their voice can shift from critic to guide, helping navigate social situations with wisdom rather than fear. Understanding the psychology of exclusion points toward the possibility of creating more inclusive environments. This isn't about forced friendships or artificial niceness, but about structures and cultures that recognize every person's inherent worth. In schools, this might mean implementing friendship benches where children can sit when they need someone to play with, training students in conflict resolution and empathy, and teaching explicitly about the impact of exclusion. Teachers can use random grouping methods for projects, create opportunities for every child to share their interests and expertise, and model inclusive language and behavior. In workplaces, inclusion might involve examining meeting dynamics to ensure all voices are heard, creating mentorship programs that support individuals from different backgrounds, and addressing the subtle ways that some employees become invisible while others dominate discussions. Inclusion means validating each child's unique personality, rather than trying to force them into predetermined molds. Teaching siblings about kindness and empathy, and creating family traditions that honor everyone's contributions. The impact of exclusion extends beyond individual pain to collective loss. When we exclude others, we lose access to their perspectives, talents, and contributions. The quiet child who never speaks up might have insights that could benefit everyone. The different child who gets pushed to the margins might possess creativity that could inspire innovation. The struggling child who gets written off might have resilience that could teach others about perseverance. Research in organizational psychology consistently shows that diverse, inclusive teams outperform homogeneous ones in creativity, problem-solving, and innovation. This isn't just about demographic diversity, but about creating environments where different thinking styles, personalities, and approaches are valued rather than merely tolerated. The excluded child represents untapped potential, both their own and the group's. When we fail to include, we all become smaller, less capable, less human than we could be together. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of understanding exclusion psychology is recognizing that stories can be rewritten. The excluded child's narrative doesn't have to end in permanent woundedness or lifelong isolation. With awareness, compassion, and intention, it can become a story of transformation, empathy, and ultimately healing. This rewriting happens both individually and collectively. On an individual level, it means the adult who was once excluded can learn to see their difference as strength, their sensitivity as wisdom, their experience of pain as a bridge to understanding others. They can choose to become the person they needed when they were young. The one who notices the left out, who creates space for the different, who remembers what it feels like to stand on the outside. On a collective level, rewriting the story means communities, schools, families, and organizations examining their cultures of inclusion and exclusion. It means asking hard questions about who feels welcome and who doesn't, whose voices are heard and whose are overlooked, what invisible barriers exist, and how they can be dismantled. In the end, the story of the excluded child is universal, not because everyone experiences identical rejection, but because everyone understands the fundamental human need to belong. Whether we were the excluded child ourselves, witnessed exclusion happening to others, or even participated in excluding someone else, we all carry some understanding of how fragile and precious belonging can be. This shared understanding becomes the foundation for building more compassionate communities. When we remember our own moments of feeling left out, we're more likely to notice when others are struggling with the same experience. When we acknowledge the times we've excluded others, we can commit to doing better in the future. The excluded child teaches us that belonging isn't a luxury or a privilege, but a fundamental human need. They remind us that small acts of inclusion can have profound impacts, that noticing someone's pain can begin their healing, that creating space for difference makes everyone stronger. As we move forward in understanding the psychology of exclusion, the call is clear to become more aware of the excluded children around us and within us, to recognize that exclusion isn't just a childhood problem, but a human problem that shows up in countless forms throughout life, to understand that our response to others' differentness shapes not just their story, but our own capacity for empathy and connection. The excluded child stands as both warning and invitation, warning us about the power we hold to wound or heal through our acceptance or rejection of others, and inviting us into the deeper understanding that comes from recognizing our shared vulnerability and need for belonging. In every interaction, we have the opportunity to be the person who sees the one standing alone, who makes space at the table, who asks the question that lets someone know their thoughts matter. We have the chance to be the adult that the excluded child in all of us needed, and in doing so to heal not just others but ourselves. The story of the excluded child doesn't have to end in exclusion. It can end in recognition, in connection, in the simple but revolutionary act of belonging, and perhaps in offering that belonging to others, we finally learn to give it to ourselves.